Hi everybody, welcome to another video where we are going to be talking through the 8th century prophets, starting with the book of Amos. So today is going to be our Amos lecture, or this particular mini lecture is going to be the Amos lecture. But before we talk specifically about Amos, we're going to need to set the stage by talking about what's going on in the 8th century. The 8th century is really important for what's happening in ancient Israel at this time. And for understanding Amos, you can't really understand Amos until you understand what's going on in the 8th century. So first things first is the early 8th century is an age of Israelite prosperity. And by that, I mean particularly the prosperity of the northern kingdom of Israel. So Assyrian international power had basically weakened around 800 BCE. So basically the king of Assyria, who had been powerful at that point, had collected a lot of vassals and so on through this region. That Assyrian king died around 800, and then many of those vassals who were in place basically enjoyed relative freedom for about 50 years because Assyria was not able to exert that control for that 50-year period. So essentially what's going on is here's Assyria, and around the 8th century, they had worked their way all the way down into northern Israel, and this was the furthest reach of the Assyrian Empire at around 800. And then when the king died, when the Assyrian king died in 800, basically things had to pull back a little bit, in a number of the vassal states and all of that in this region basically became free agents. They had some prosperity as a result of not paying the same level of taxes and all of that to Assyria, and they were more independent, basically between Egypt and Assyria, but not really necessarily beholden to either one, while still serving as a pass-through for all of this trade. So they were able to kind of maximize that sweet spot for about 50 years. And you can see that period reflected in 1 Kings 14, the end of 1 Kings 14, which we'll see here. So we see right here. In the 15th year, 1 Kings or 2 Kings 14:23 and following, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria. So this is a different Jeroboam, by the way. This is Jeroboam the second. Jeroboam, the son of Joash, became king in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. He did evil in the sight of Adonai, and he did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. He restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of Adonai, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who is of Gath Hepher. Now you need to remember that because Jonah, we actually have a book about Jonah in the latter prophets, in the book of the 12. We'll read that book later in the semester. This is where Jonah comes into the story here. So he spoke this word through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was of Gath Hepher. For Adonai saw the affliction of Israel, which was very bitter, and there was neither bond nor free, nor was there any helper for Israel. But Adonai did not say that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. Now all the acts of Jeroboam and all that he did and all his might and how he fought and how he recovered for Israel, Damascus and Hamath, which had belonged to Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jeroboam slept with his fathers, and even with the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son became king in his place. So Jeroboam actually expands the Israelite kingdom all the way up from these borders, all the way up to Damascus. So he expands Israelite power essentially all the way through this region as Assyria is not in charge. And you see actually Hamath is here. That's where it says Jeroboam ruled from Samaria over the region from the Arabah, which is right down in here, all the way up to Hamath. So he's basically, according to the text, in control all the way up to there. And you can see in the early Assyrian Empire, they worked into that. Assyria is essentially the border here. They're in control all the way up to here. But Israel, according to the narrative, Jeroboam II takes control of this whole region and is not really under any other empire to the degree that they had been previously. So this is a pretty prosperous time for Samaria and for Israel. So at this point, Israel and also Judah reached their greatest prosperity. This is a more prosperous time even than what you had under Solomon and all of those things. This is the most prosperous time that you're going to see in Israelite history. So this period, you're getting a revival of international trade. They recognize that Assyria and Egypt are going to be rebuilding and all of this. So they're going to eventually flex their power again. So they build towns and fortresses and basically are trying to establish clear defenses for all of those things. And Jeroboam II gets control over a lot of the areas that had been taken by the kingdom of Damascus and takes Damascus actually as a vassal state. And so we see actually in the archaeological records from Samaria, we get all sorts of evidence that the number of wealthy Israelites in this region exploded. There's a lot more material prosperity evident. And we've got, records on potsherds, on ostraca as they're called, on potsherds where there are records kept about trade that include all sorts of luxury items. So that's something worth noting. That's an important thing to remember. The problem is that this period of Israelite prosperity during the reign of Jeroboam II only really lasts until the death of Jeroboam II. And Assyria is quickly rebuilding its power shortly after that. So Jeroboam II dies in 750 BCE, and within 5 years, Tiglath-Pileser III, Tiglath-Pileser, we'll call him TP3 through the rest of this time, a renowned point guard. Tiglath-Pileser becomes the new king of Assyria. He overthrows the prior dynasty, and he was just frustrated basically at the incompetence and lack of expansion of the empire. And he was a brilliant general and administrator and reestablished Assyria as a power. You can basically see what happened under Tiglath-Pileser right here. Tiglath-Pileser sets the stage for this. So this doesn't all happen during his reign, but he and his sons, he and his immediate descendants do this. So Assyria takes everything. They become not just the dominant player in Mesopotamia, where they had been for a long time dominant. They become dominant through the whole ancient Near East. So that's kind of important. And he basically, in the process, brings an end to that prosperous, quasi-independent era of both Israel and Judah. And he takes about 75% of the land of the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you think about where Israel is, they've got this land all the way up to Hamath that they're in control of. He takes control of everything from here down to about there, becomes just straight under the Assyrian rule, and then the remaining southern piece becomes a small vassal state under him. So that's a pretty big move that TP3 manages to do. So he reconquers all these prior vassal states and then expands the Assyrian Empire beyond that. So from TP3 on, Assyria basically deals with a lesser conquered nation in 3 stages. So they show up and they say, they send envoys and all this, and they say, okay, our ambassadors demand that you recognize Assyrian sovereignty, and we're going to require that you pay taxes to Assyria, and then we'll invest in your area and all that, but we'll make sure we'll let you, govern as you please, but we're going to demand taxes. Now, if resistance develops, then they're going to send in the military, and they're going to diminish the kingdom further. They're going to demand more tribute, and if there's any sort of fighting or any resistance or anything like that, they're going to take the upper class, the people who led the rebellion, and they're going to remove them from the kingdom. And the people who actually de facto led the rebellion, they're going to lose their heads. Now, if there's further resistance after this, after they place even higher taxes on, if there's further resistance, then they're just going to come in and deport most of the population, and they're going to remove all of the upper class and anybody that could potentially rule, and they're going to resettle the area with new inhabitants from elsewhere in their empire. This is ultimately what happens to the Northern Kingdom. The citizens get scattered, and we're gonna talk about that. Now, step 3 is genocide by today's standards. So, the Assyrians were practicing genocide for roughly a millennium. Now, this 8th century happens to be when the first writing prophets, the earliest of the latter prophets, do their thing. So that's Amos and Hosea in the north, Isaiah and Micah in the south. And I'll repeat that again because I'll ask some questions about this later in the semester. Amos and Hosea in the north, Isaiah and Micah in the south. So they're actually prophesying during this time of decline from the high point of the early 8th century, while Israel is declining and Judah is declining in the late 8th century. And that brings us to Amos. Amos is the earliest of the writing prophets. Actually, you know what? I'm going to split this. I'm going to go ahead and do the next. I'm going to make that the lecture on the 8th century history in general, and then we're going to do Amos as a third lecture for that particular class period.